Okay, so welcome everybody. My name is Ross Miller, and what we're going to do today is we have a session here on World War One. Let me share my screen. There we go. So hopefully everybody can see this. So World War One is a subject that will be tested, as far as I know, on the GED. So I'll just run through some of the topics that you might see. So I just want to let you guys know that there's plenty of information online if you have access to the internet. There's tons of videos if you would like to listen to videos. There's 5-minute videos, 10-minute videos, 30-minute videos, anything that you want about World War I that's more interesting than I can make it. So just keep that in mind when you go through World War I. So what I did was I found a bunch of presentations and I sort of put them together to go over 4 of the main areas about World War I. So you have the causes of World War I, how the U.S. became involved, what was our role, and then the end of World War I. So if you need to rewind and listen to any of the sections, please do so. Please feel free to rewind or pause or anything if you need to. So normally the causes of World War I, there's an easy way to remember it, and it's MAIN, if you can see that up in the top left corner. Hopefully everybody can see that. It's this is how it's taught in school, at least when I was teaching World War I. So you have the causes, countries involved. This is a political cartoon talking about some of the different countries that were involved in World War I. Lots of cartoons and pictures that we'll all be able to see. So the M stands for militarism, and I'm hoping that you understand or see that military falls into militarism. So it's a buildup of the military. And we're talking about, and I noticed that the years weren't on here, so we're talking about 1900, 1910, a little over 100 years ago, all these events are starting. So we have the glorification of war and the glorification of being in the military. Lots of countries began to compete with each other over land and who had the largest army. I know it's kind of goofy to think about it that way, but what I think about it with some of my students in high school is you want to pretend like maybe you're having a snowball fight with somebody across the street and you see them stockpiling and gathering a bunch of snowballs. What are you going to do? You're going to gather up your own. And if you see that they have more, you're going to make more. So that's kind of what was going on, very simplified. But during this period, you had a lot of building up of armies and navies, ships and tanks and planes. Everybody was trying to outdo the other countries. You also had countries kind of trying to claim as many colonies that they could. So colonies would be countries that they owned. So you'll see, I think there's a map here of some colonies. So here's an example of glorification of war. You've got the soldiers fighting and getting pumped up to fight. Oh, maybe there isn't a map, but some of the colonies like Great Britain or England had India. So France had its own colonies and Germany had its own colonies. So there was a race to gather up as many colonies as they could. So M was militarism. A stands for alliances. So an alliance, kind of the word in there is an ally. So we're looking at friends. So you might have alliances with some people. A group of friends or your family can be an alliance. So some of these countries formed alliances with other countries. Why would they do that? Well, it increased their strength, and it's almost like if you remember in the schoolyard getting picked for teams for baseball or basketball or something, you want to make your team as strong as you can. So these countries were picking other countries to kind of be on their side. And, you know, just like any other sport, you're going to kind of dislike the other team. So you have these alliances. Here's kind of a cartoon that talks about people allying with each other. Here's the Power Rangers, if you remember them. The I in Maine is imperialism, and that's a whole other topic, but basically, very briefly, it means European countries trying to get other lands, other colonies. So imperialism. The more colonies you got, the more power. The United States was involved in this too. Cuba, Philippines, Hawaii, these were areas that the United States gained during this time of imperialism. All of these European countries wanted money, power. So that's the I, that's imperialism. You can see here, this is a really good example. It's kind of a racist political cartoon from back in the day, but I use this in school. You can see all of these figures represent countries from Europe, and they're carving up China. So you can see they all have their knives, and China kind of looks like, I mean, it kind of looks like a pizza to me. So all of them are trying to get their piece of the pie, right? So you've got England, Germany in there. They're all sort of carving up China, trying to get a piece of the action. Oh, here's the map. So you can see here, up in the top left is the year, 1914. So the colonies, Europe was trying to get as many colonies as they could. And you can see here, United States is involved, United Kingdom, France, Portugal, Spain. Look at the map of the world and how many colors it is. This is all of the colonies that these countries were trying to get. So if you want to pause it, you can pause and just sort of like look at, like France, for example, is blue. So these are some countries that France had taken over kind of and was using to get like resources from it. The N is the final letter in Maine, and that's nationalism. And that's just pride in your country. So generally that can be a good thing, right? You might have pride in being an American, or maybe if you're from another country originally, you could have pride in being from that particular country. The problem is when it starts to get violent, and some people during this time in the early 1900s, you think that your country is the best, the strongest, and you might develop hatred toward your other countries. So being nationalist and being prideful in your having pride in being an American or whatever is great. But during this time, everybody started to think that it's great to be a German, or it's great to be English or French, and it led to some problems. So this is a nationalism cartoon, and you can see here again some of the countries in the world carving up the world. So France and England, everybody wanted their piece of the pie. What exactly caused World War I? And they call it the spark. So the beginning was an assassination of a political figure. Not necessarily, I don't know if you'll need to know this for the GED, but there was a guy named Francis Ferdinand from Austria-Hungary. That A-H over there on the screen means Austria-Hungary. That was one of the countries back then. He was visiting a town called Sarajevo. Here's a picture of his parade with his wife. This was in 1914. And you can imagine, right? Something bad happens. He is assassinated during the parade. So I believe this picture was taken just an hour or so before he was gunned down. And unfortunately, the assassin was from a country named Serbia, and that led to all sorts of problems that sort of, some people think of the beginning of World War I as the beginning of dominoes. So if you've ever seen any of those YouTube videos of like 1,000 dominoes in like a very intricate pattern, and all it takes is like one little tap and the whole dominoes fall. So normally people in World War I refer to that little tap as this assassination. So this assassination kind of got things moving. And the guy that's shaking hands there in the picture, his name was Archduke Francis Ferdinand, or Franz Ferdinand sometimes. So this is the sides. This is World War I. These are the teams, if you want to call them those. You had the Allies, and it's a little bit faded, but in the red you can see some of the countries that were included in the Allies: England, France, Italy, Russia. And then you have the other side, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Turkey. Those are the two sides, kind of. These are the two teams, and other countries began to join sides. So that was kind of the first part. The second part is what led the United States to join the war. So first you need to know that yes, the United States was involved in World War I. So what events happened, who did it, and then the impact of the United States. And if I'm going too fast, make sure to pause me if you need to, or you can rewind. This is a painting of one of the famous events that we'll talk about that led the United States to join the war. So one of the events was these things called U-boats, which is just another word for submarines. So we're talking about the years, just to put you into the time period, 1914, 1915, 1916. So the British Navy from England set up a blockade around Europe. What a blockade would mean is they sort of surrounded Europe with their ships so nothing could get through. They set up kind of like a blockage, if you will. And ships tried to get through the blockade and they could not. So they had food and other items that they wanted to bring into Europe, but Britain would not let them. So Germany was like, okay, we need food and we need other items, so we're going to get our submarines out there and we're going to sink these ships. And it was called unrestricted submarine warfare. In other words, the Germans were going to sink any ship. They didn't care. They were just going to sink it with their submarines. So, of course, the United States gets involved and said, okay, we have ships out there. If you see one of our ships, you better not sink it. Do not sink our ships. Here's an example. I think this is a German U-boat. And I don't think I mentioned this, but at this time, the United States was neutral. So that means that they were not on either team yet. The United States was not on either team. They were not on the Allies and they were not on the Central Powers. They were off to the side, kind of watching. That painting that you saw a couple slides ago was a ship called the Lusitania. And this was one of the main events that the United States sort of began to think about, we're going to enter the war. So this again is another cartoon of one of the ships that was sunk by the Germans. So they started sinking American ships anyway. And eventually Germany said, we're not going to sink any more ships with passengers, but we will sink ships with war materials on it. Ammunition probably, or gunpowder or something like that. So this ship from Britain was called the Lusitania, and it carried passengers. The problem was Germany sunk it anyway, and it killed over like 1,000 people. And another major problem was there were 128 Americans on board. Can you imagine today in 2020 if this happened? If another country sunk a ship containing 128 Americans, it will be on the news all the time. You can imagine how upset and angry Americans were that Germany did this. So the US again demanded that Germany stop sinking these ships. Here again is kind of an artist's drawing of the Lusitania sinking. You can see it here. And the US began to hide supplies on passenger ships headed over to Britain. So that was one cause of the United States joining the war, the sinking of the Lusitania. The second was something called the Zimmermann Note. This one I think you'll find interesting. Germany in I think it was 16, sends Mexico a telegram. Basically, Germany said, okay, Mexico, if you join on our side, we will help you get back land that the United States took from you. So this was a secret note. And Germany said, okay, Mexico, you need to go to war with the United States and join on our side. And if you do it, we will help you get back some land that you had originally lost to the United States. And they wanted really to keep, Germany wanted to keep the United States busy so that the United States wouldn't enter World War I. You can see here a political cartoon of a German whispering into the ear of a Mexican saying, join with Germany and you get a bit of the United States. So this was a kind of poking fun at the deal between Germany and Mexico. There's been some debate, and you don't really have to worry about this a ton, but there is some debate over whether the Zimmermann Note was real, and now some people believe it was made up by the British to increase America's hatred toward Germany. So I don't think that's ever been proven, but just something to think about. So the United States now enters the war. So we've talked about the causes of World War I with MAIN, militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. We talked about the United States, why they joined the war, and two of the main reasons would be the Zimmermann Note and the sinking of the Lusitania, which killed 128 Americans. Now we have the United States entering the war, and they are doing it on the side of the Allies. So they enter with the Allies, so that would be France and England and Russia for a part of it. Again, you have Britain, France, Serbia, Italy, Russia. Those are on the United States team. At this point, the Allies were close to losing the war, so the United States joining was a huge lift. You can imagine the Cleveland Cavaliers a couple years ago losing to another team, and then all of a sudden LeBron James gets put into the game. I mean, that's a huge lift, right? I'm not necessarily comparing the United States to LeBron James, but it was a huge lift for the Allies. They needed men to fight the war. They needed money. The United States provided that. They needed supplies. The United States supplied that. You can see here, here's a picture from World War I of some of the soldiers from America landing over in Europe. And you can see the United States flag being carried by some of the soldiers. What was our role? What was the role of the United States in World War I? So we're going to look at how we got ready for the war, concerns, civil rights during the war. Here are some posters to try to encourage American men to enlist in the Army or Navy or something. So here's another one, a wonderful opportunity for you to join the Navy. So that would be a poster that you might see at the library or at your church or at City Hall. And it was meant to get you ready to fight the war or to join the Navy. Maybe some of you have been in the military or you know somebody that has enlisted. And I think we have a student that popped in, so just wanted to say a quick hi.
Hey.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. My name is Ross Miller. We're just kind of running through World War I today. So we're I've gone through probably 10 or 11 slides, so this will be recorded. So
Okay.
right now we're just talking about the role of the United States in World War I. So
Okay.
about 100 years ago, a little over 100 years ago, long time ago. So the first thing that we talked about was the need for soldiers. When the United States joined World War I, we really didn't have that big of a military. So the number one thing that you need people to fight. So we had to expand our army, our navy. What we did was we passed something in the United States called the Selective Service Act in 1917, and this was a draft. My guess is a lot of you that are watching this have heard of a draft for the military. So this was set up for a draft. So you can join the military two ways, right? One, volunteer, or two, you are drafted into the military. That sometimes is not your choice. So sometimes you're just drafted into the military. So that's what this was. It was a draft to just fill up the Army and Navy with men to fight. So back then it was all males between the ages of 18 and 45. You had to go register for this Selective Service Act. And most of the men, if you guys are watching this, I know I had to do it when I turned 18. I think I was in maybe at the end of high school, you had to register for the Selective Service Act. So maybe some of you remember registering for it at some point. This was one of the good recruiting posters that you might see around. This is probably the most famous one. You might remember this from school. I want you for the U.S. Army. That's Uncle Sam pointing at you. It's supposed to make you feel like you should join the Army. So maybe you would be walking down the street and you see this and you're like, okay, I'm going to go fulfill my duty and go and enlist in the Army. So now that the United States is getting soldiers to fight the war, they had to do something called mobilize, which means kind of a little bit what we're doing now with the coronavirus is we're shifting our economy toward fighting the virus. So some companies are instead, like some of the car companies like Ford, are instead of making cars, they're making face masks. So it's kind of the same thing. Some of the companies back then, they shifted toward war products like tanks, guns, planes, ships, bullets, ammunition, bombs. So the government began to assume control over some of the economy. Oops. So that was part of the mobilizing for war. Again, if you need to pause for anything, if you're watching the recording, make sure to pause if you need to go take a break or anything. And I can't remember your name that you popped in here.
Brianna?
Brianna, okay. So
Yes.
Brianna, if you have any questions or anything, just let me know too. I know I'm kind of moving a little fast.
Oh no, you're fine.
Okay.
Pretty a quick learner, so I get it.
Okay. And you know what? A lot of you guys took World War I in school, so some of this might be a little bit familiar.
Yeah, all this right here is like easy stuff to me in school. It was really like math that was really the hardest thing for me to learn. So
I know. I don't think you're alone at all. Definitely, math seems to be the area that uh, causes people the most concern, right?
yep.
So we'll just treat this kind of as a review of World War I for people that when they're getting ready to take the social studies part of the GED.
Okay.
So we were looking at mobilization. So a lot of men left their jobs to fight the war. 4.8 million Americans will serve in World War I. So almost 5 million Americans served in the war. 2 million served in the American Expeditionary Force, which was the name given to the troops that went over to Europe. So all these men left, and they left their jobs behind. So what happened? Women and minorities who normally didn't have these jobs got them. So working in factories, this will happen in World War II also. Typical jobs that men had done for a long time, women slipped into those roles, and minorities, especially, that were kind of denied those jobs because of race, things like that, they were now given the chance to make money in these jobs that they typically weren't allowed to do before. So that would be a good result for the war.
Mhm.
Here's just some pictures of the war effort and out in Europe, and then troops were called the doughboys. I think the next slide looks at what a typical American soldier would wear. So they're known as doughboys. This was a goofy, somebody found this here, the Pillsbury Doughboy, if you can picture that in your head. And then here's kind of what a typical soldier would have to carry with him in World War I. So you have all these crazy things you have to make sure that you're carrying with you during the war. And a good way to think about it is, how does this guy differ than in 2020? I mean, I don't see much protection from bullets. There's no bulletproof vest. There's no real, there's no night vision goggles or Kevlar vests or anything. Unfortunately, he's pretty vulnerable to a lot of the stuff during World War I. So one of the things that for war is war is expensive. So this was a way to raise money for the war effort. They were called Liberty Bonds. So basically, it's a loan to the government. So you might buy $100 Liberty Bond. So your $100 goes to the government, and then they would pay you back later. So these posters were meant to kind of convince us to lend money to the government. So there's a bunch of examples here. So the hope was that normal everyday citizens would see these and be convinced to buy a Liberty Bond. And I talk about this in class with my high school students, and I'm like, well, what would we do today? And it's a great example. If you watch TV or go online for the coronavirus, raising money for that, like texting a certain word to a certain number will raise $10, or some of the celebrities or musicians have been having fundraisers. So most of that's done online now. Of course, this was during World War I, so there was not an internet. So how did the government try to raise money? Posters. And you can see they're hopefully they're meant to gain your attention, right? Not sure if it gains our attention these days, but that's what they were meant for. Some of the concerns during the war, and this is stuff that was going on within the United States, is you had this called propaganda. And propaganda, those posters were a great example of propaganda. And it's a fancy word. Some of you might even know what it is. In fact, most of you might know what propaganda is, and it's just efforts to persuade us to support the war. So back then, really, what could they do besides make some fancy posters to have people support the war effort? Just like any other war, there were Americans that didn't support it. Here's a great example of a propaganda poster. So you can see here, it's kind of yelling at you, in all caps. If you send a text with all caps, if you want to yell at somebody over a text, you put all caps, right? So this is a woman who's sleeping. She's supposed to represent the United States, and you can see kind of in the background, storm clouds are brewing, and this poster is urging us to wake up. Probably it's trying to encourage us either to buy Liberty bonds or to enlist in the army. So this is a great example of propaganda, trying to get people to do something. And in this case, you're supposed to try to like shake this woman and say, wake up. There's a war going on, right? Here's another one, halt the Hun, buy US government bonds from Third Liberty Loan, whatever that is. You can see here, this is a drawing of a Hun would be a German. So it was kind of trying to make the Germans seem dirty and kind of disgusting as our enemies. So this was a case, and this might come up on the GED, I don't know, but it was a case with the Supreme Court called Schenck versus the United States. And it was about, can you criticize the government during wartime? So I think the case was about a guy who was passing out some papers that were against the United States during the war, and he was arrested. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court had to decide. Normally, we have free speech in the United States, right? We can pretty much say what we want and do what we want. So the Supreme Court had to decide, is it okay during a war to pass out papers that say, that criticize the government? So imagine you were to go on to Facebook and post something critical of the government. We can certainly do that, right? I mean, this is America. We should be allowed to do that. So imagine that you posted something about how the government is handling the coronavirus and you got arrested for it. That's kind of similar to what happened to this guy, Schenck. So what the Supreme Court said was that, yes, speech can be restricted during wartime. And the best way to think about this is a very famous example is, imagine you go into a movie theater whenever movie theaters are open again. Imagine you go into a movie theater and you yell fire. What's everybody going to do in that crowded movie theater? They're all going to rush to get out, right? So even if there is no fire and you go in and you yell fire, there could be some serious injuries. So that's kind of the rule here, is that it's called clear and present danger. And this is stuff that I don't think will be on the GED for it. But if you want to get a full picture of what it was like during World War I here at home in the United States, the Supreme Court did come out with something that said that freedom of speech can be restricted by the government during wartime. That was their ruling. You can see here kind of a visual representation of free speech being kind of put into a cage. All right, end of World War I. So we're moving on to I think this is the last section. So who won? What was the impact? Here's the end of the war in 1918. November 11th is kind of the official end of World War I. These are some of the dates of the Central Powers when they surrendered: September 29th, October 30th, and then people kind of treat November 11th as the official end because that's when Germany surrendered. So they signed something called an armistice, and that's just the end of a war. That's kind of, okay, our war is now over. The Allies win, and it's kind of the official end of the war would be on 11/11/18, so November 11th. So we're talking about almost exactly 100 years ago, World War I ended. Our president at the time was Woodrow Wilson. So he went over to Europe and met with the leaders of Europe, and they all tried to figure out, well, what do we do now? What do we do now? And they started to discuss peace. what is the world going to look like after World War I is over? And you can see at the top, it's a drawing of kind of the surrender of Germany. And then underneath is people celebrating the end of the war. So the next couple of slides, I want you to think about how could this go after this? This was the most devastating war in history up to this point. So how's it going to go? If you're the winners, how are you going to treat the losers? Are you going to treat them with respect, or are you going to punish them for what they did? So that's kind of going to be the two things that are going to come out of this. Are they either going to, and I'm not saying one way is right or wrong. I'm sure some of you have been in fights with people before, whether it's family or friends. After that fight is over, how do you handle that situation? Forgive and forget and move on? Never talk to the person again? You know, think about that as I go through these slides. Kind of try to relate it to your own experiences. Our president, President Woodrow Wilson, he wants peace throughout the entire world. He wanted to make sure that there would never be another war like World War I. So he goes over there to Europe and he tries to make peace. And he says, let's not blame anybody for the war. It happened. Yes, let's move on. There's Woodrow Wilson. He's got his hat up. So that's a picture of him in Europe. And then these are the four leaders of, I think it's Italy and France and Britain. And then Woodrow Wilson is all the way on the right. He's the tall guy, sort of with his face kind of profiled. So he went over to talk to these European countries and he wanted to be involved in peace talks. He came up with something called the 14 points. These are some of the things that he wanted after World War I was over. No secret alliances. Do you remember the causes of World War I? The A was alliances. So he said, no more of these secret alliances that led to World War I. Here's a picture of a newspaper in the United States in 1918. So it says Germany asks for peace on Wilson's 14 points. So he had this thing called the 14 points. That was his sort of his thing. Some of the most important things, he proposed the League of Nations, which would settle all disputes between countries peacefully. The goal of this was to make sure that war didn't happen. So if two countries had an argument, they should go in front of the League of Nations first before they fought a war. So maybe you've been in an argument with somebody and then you bring in somebody else to kind of listen to you before you actually make things worse. So that was kind of the idea of the League of Nations. He also wanted to not punish Germany for the war. Don't blame Germany. Harsh punishment might lead to another conflict. So that's one side of the debate. Don't punish Germany. League of Nations to kind of keep things, try to avoid another war. Well, didn't work. Everybody wound up signing this thing called the Treaty of Versailles. The leaders of Europe wanted revenge on Germany. So the United States talked and talked and talked. They didn't get their way. European countries blamed Germany. They wanted Germany punished. They did not listen to President Wilson. And you can see here, this is a kind of a political cartoon of the European countries feeding Germany a big peace term ball. And you can see Germany does not want to swallow it. So they kind of forced Germany to do this kind of stuff. So again, I don't know which is right, which is wrong, but United States wanted one thing and Europe wanted another thing, and Europe did not listen to the United States. So this was the League of Nations was actually established. It was an organization of countries. The goal was to prevent violence. But if you remember, Woodrow Wilson and the United States wanted the League of Nations, or I should say, Woodrow Wilson, the president, he wanted the League of Nations. But in order for the United States to join, the Senate had to approve the treaty, and the Senate refused to do so. Congress refused to do so. So this is the League of Nations, and the United States never joins it. So a lot of other countries join it, and it was kind of the idea of the United States, but the United States never joined it. And they were worried that if they joined the League of Nations, they would be dragged into another war, which is understandable, right? They had just fought World War I. They lost thousands and thousands of soldiers. Why would they want to get involved in another bad war? So that's another thing that might be on the GED is this League of Nations, where the U.S. refused to join it. And I think that's it.
Okay.
So we talked about what? The causes of World War I. We talked about the United States joining, why they joined, how they joined, and then we sort of looked at the end of World War I and whether the United States would get its way or whether the other countries in Europe would get their way. So if you rewatch this, it's kind of split up into 4 different parts of World War I. And this is not meant to be like total overview of World War I. There's lots of other information out there on World War I, but I do think this kind of goes over a good summary of what you might see on a test for World War I.
Okay. Great. So that was great.
Okay,
So
glad you
thank you
liked
for
it.
that.
You're welcome.
Okay.